I'd like to begin with maybe a little bit of a mystery here. I have this book that has come into my hands. I found it on Amazon. I don't know the exact circumstances, except that I have been looking all over the world to see if there was something like this. And what is this? It's simply a book written by a modest American, probably minister. He's from Cincinnati, Ohio, apparently. His name is Adolf Lehmann, and that would indicate that, and there was one other Adolf Lehmann historically, German-American, but clearly American. And what I've been looking for and have found in this one book and haven't found anywhere else, it was published in 1917. It's called The World to Come, subtitled The Progressive Manifestation of the Kingdom of God Among Men. This book published in 1917. What is it? It's the one thing that I've found that gets it right. So one of the things I want to talk about, get a conversation going about, concerns something really, truly weird. And maybe it's because I come from a Jewish background. I'm intensely interested in Christianity, but I am Jewish. I come to it from a certain kind of angle, and maybe it's because of that I don't have on certain kinds of blinders that we've talked about, that I come to it even, you might say, with a certain kind of naivete of perception that allows me to see, or allows me perhaps more properly to read correctly. In this case, read the New Testament and answer the question, what is it saying here? What are the ideas at work here? The astonishing conclusion that I have been driven to over the course of the last couple of decades, but at the same time with a certain kind of acceleration that has gone on, so that in recent times it's been really quite hectic in my mind, is the fact that we don't really understand what the New Testament is saying. It is saying something entirely different. It's talking about a reality which is totally different from the reality that we are taught as Christianity.
Are you talking about the Gospels, Paul's letters? What sections are you talking about?
I'm talking, yes. First of all, as far as any kind of difference between Jesus and Paul is concerned, it's clear that Paul and Jesus are two different human beings, two different agendas, two different challenges, two different periods of time, two different roles for sure. Nonetheless, they did have one consistent focus. The concepts, the worldview that they inhabited, call it a mythos if you want, the way that they had of thinking about their world metaphysically if you want, the basic categories through which they understood their world. I'm talking about Jesus as compared to Paul. It's the same. The New Testament is reasonably consistent in that sense. I'm speaking specifically, and I just ran into this last night in a communication with a friend of mine on Facebook, as a matter of fact. There's, just as there is among Marxists, this desire to say everything that went wrong with Marxism was due to Engels. He screwed everything up. Marx is the real deal. There has been in Christianity a tendency to make Paul into a whipping boy for everything that went wrong with Christianity. Jesus is the real deal, and Paul gets it wrong. Somehow, you get off. I don't accept that. I don't think it's valid.
Would that be because Paul doesn't really concentrate on any of Jesus' teachings, or that he didn't see him in the flesh or whatever?
It is true. That is true. Paul is next to totally uninterested, almost totally uninterested in the biography of Jesus, and as you say, in the teachings of Jesus. You don't get any reference whatsoever, except indirectly because the ethos is similar. You don't get direct reference to things like the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings and so forth are not there. In fact, and we've discussed this in the past, the story of Jesus becomes interesting for Paul only at the moment of his crucifixion. That's where it starts. That's chapter 1. Of course, resurrection is chapter 2. But chapter 1 for Paul, where you start the story, is with the execution of Jesus on the cross. So there are very many important differences, but not in fundamental worldview. And what I mean by that is this, just to cut right to the chase on this one. Both of them are thinking about what they called the kingdom of God. And what they called the kingdom of God, this is in both instances, the case of Jesus and the case of Paul, was conceived as this worldly, material transformation. A literal transformation of this world, as the world has been transformed in human history and also in natural history. And by the way, it is a story of the transformation of the world so that this eon, the word is used in the New Testament, aion in Greek, A-I-O-N as you would transliterate, which is the word eon, that there is an eon to come in the evolutionary story of the human species. That sounds strangely evolutionary. Aren't we supposed to be anti-evolutionary? Clearly not. That herring is so red. The idea that some people have that we ought to be hostile to biological evolutionism, for example. No. Paul is a totally evolutionary thinker. That's one aspect, by the way, of what gets totally lost. He thinks in terms of cosmic ages. He thinks in terms of an earlier age. He's capable of thinking before Adam, the age of Adam, the age of after Noah becomes significant. It depends on how you want to break it down. Moses marks a new age. Jesus marks another age, and it's still not over. Because even though Jesus came and brought the transition to the newest stage here, he is the first fruits. In our lifetime, Paul thought, the actual process of transformation to a new material organization of the world was going to be happening. And that they called the kingdom of God. And they thought that it would be, with God's help, something that happened as a material transformation, something that we build.
I think at this point it might be good to bring in the fact that in the New Testament it doesn't proceed linearly. The Gospels come first. Yes, it's true that Paul's letters are the first-person account, and they're the earliest writings in terms of the written documents, but there are sections of the Gospel that come before the influence of Paul, such as the Q document, that center very heavily on things like you mentioned, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teachings, a number of the parables were most likely in the Q document, whether it was written or verbal. But then you have Paul that actually comes in between when the Q document may have been compiled. Then you have the ideas of Paul's that we see in his letters. Now you have the gospel writers now combining both of those. They take the Q document and certainly much of the storyline that they get from Mark, but how they interpret things is very heavily influenced by the teachings of Paul. So you really don't get, other than the Q document, a clear vision of what Jesus may have actually been teaching. The Gospels tend to present all of that to us as a continuing story, but it actually wasn't. You had Jesus, and then you had Paul's ideas, and these get combined in the later Gospels to basically give their particular spin on things.
Right, and the reconstruction of the actual biography of Jesus, the search for the historical Jesus, as Schweitzer called it, and something that preoccupied some of the greatest minds of the 19th and 20th centuries, an attempt to get to the real historical Jesus. This is notoriously difficult. You can make your guesses and some good conjectures. When we were talking the other day, I was trying to make the point that it seems to me that certain things ring clear as he must have really been like this, namely his use of parables. I mean, it seems to me that we're on fairly solid ground, as we are in any kind of historical conjecture, and in all of history, whether we're talking about Julius Caesar or Jesus Christ, depends upon some attempt at reconstruction based upon whatever documents we have.
And parables are traditional, a standardized Jewish way of teaching. There are parables in the Old Testament, so within his Jewish context there in terms of how he's teaching.
Remember also that even though, to date things, you're right, Paul writes his first letter in the late 40s, perhaps AD, and does most of his letter writing in the 50s, middle 50s especially. So for Paul, the years 56, 7, and 8 are the climactic important years of his letter writing. In that particular time, he's writing Galatians, both Corinthians, and also, of course, Romans. And actually First Thessalonians came earlier, and that was the very first letter we have. And those are the first writings in the New Testament that we actually do have. It's also important to reinforce your point about the importance of Paul, that he came before the gospel writers. I want to pick up on that point. It's very important. Yes, Paul wrote his letters around the middle 50s. It's not until the middle 60s, sometime between 65 and 70, that Mark is the author of the very first, historically the first gospel that we have. They usually say between 65 and 70 AD. Then come Matthew and Luke. Matthew perhaps a little earlier than Luke, but both about a decade after Mark. And then comes John, probably in the middle 90s. Although the interesting fact is that Luke and Mark were both travelers in the entourage of Paul at the most important part of his missionary travels. Mark, the gospel writer, and Luke, who tells the whole story of Paul in the part 2 of his work. He writes the gospel, and then he also writes the book of Acts to tell that whole continuous story. Luke was the chronicler of Paul's story in the book of Acts, having traveled. He could be the chronicler. And he actually, in many passages in Acts, written that we then stopped here and we did this. It becomes autobiographical. So Luke was there with Paul. Likewise, Mark was there. Mark was brilliant in supposedly in speaking, in preaching. Very, very good at that. At least that's one reconstruction of some of the words that we have. It's an interesting question. We try to figure out as much as we can. But both of them were with Paul at crucial moments of his voyage. They knew him personally. They spent weeks and months at his side. At night, the candle would be burning, and they would be talking Christianity, or what we now call. They would be talking what they were up to.
So maybe we could kind of jump back to, you were making a point about the kingdom of God.
Right. Okay. So let's get down to this. In a way to make it sensational sounding. I kind of want to give it the title at some point. Everything you know about Christianity is false. What we're taught. Let's start with the simplest thing. What we're taught about death and immortality. We're taught now that you die and go to heaven. Well, that's a very Greek idea. Paul fought against that idea. The idea that immortality consists in the survival of the individual soul, that at the moment of death, it's death, his or her death. Like the cartoon spirit, after the bad dude gets killed and suddenly he sprouts wings and he goes to heaven in the cartoons. This ethereal, bodiless creature, it's very important. It's very to understand the Greekness of this idea. It's based upon the idea of a split between the body and the spirit, which is also, when I say Greek, I'm really thinking Plato, and we get into this some other time. But in Plato, you do get this notion of a separable soul, psychic entity. And Socrates, in one of the most important of the Platonic dialogues, the Phaedo, talks about the survival of the eternal part of us, which is not material. It's not made of this stuff of the world. It's not made of atoms and molecules as commonly recognized. It's a different kind of mind or soul stuff. And when you die, that part of you goes somewhere to some realm and but your physical existence ceases. That's not what we read in the New Testament.
Well, that was also an idea that then got reinforced by Rene Descartes in his idea of the ghost and the machine, basically formalized the separation between the physical body and some nebulous soul-like material that lived on after death or is in our bodies and is separate from the material part of it.
That's excellent because in fact, yes, in modern times, in antiquity, of course, it's Plato that you talk about. There are many differences between Plato and Descartes, but there are also some interesting similarities. And one of the important similarities is this dualistic split between body and mind, or body and spirit. You can call it what you like depending upon circumstances. But it's a split between these two different things. Now, this is not Judaism, and it's not Christianity as the New Testament had it. In fact, in Christianity, the basic original Christianity, there's no thought of a future for myself as a disembodied spirit. No, the thought is of the resurrection of the dead. It's a bodily existence. One of the most important texts for this, of course, is 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul insists upon the actual embodiment that people have in the kingdom of God. Now, this means something quite definite and real. It means that the kingdom of God is the world. The world has been transformed. So the planet Earth has been around for 4.6 billion years. And in that period of time, geologically speaking, dramatic changes have occurred. Then somehow around 3 billion, give or take, years ago, life appeared on this planet. A new eon in natural history begins at this point. Life appears. We still don't get that one. But yes, in some sense, it evolved.
That's certainly consistent with Jesus' teaching on the kingdom of God, that it is here now, but then he also talks about it's to come. So he uses different tenses to talk about the same thing as if it's here, yet it's something that also has to evolve or progress.
But there's no big problem there. This gets us to something very, very important in terms of the driving metaphor. The driving metaphor that you find in the New Testament is pregnancy, along with its partner, the idea of the seed, which is planted and grows. So the kingdom of God is here indeed. Jesus teaches us, and Paul teaches it also. Paul, however, is forced to be very subtle about it in his thinking. But clearly, he and Jesus both depend upon the matter, the metaphor of gestation, pregnancy and childbirth. And in fact, in Paul, we are living at the stage of the coming into existence of the kingdom of God. Is it here? Yes. Jesus has made a decisive move. He's entered history. He is the first fruits, Paul calls him, the first fruits. But, but the process has begun.
Is it possible that you talked about our current idea of what heaven is in terms of it's a place that we go when we die?
Yeah.
You're correct in that was not the case for earliest Christianity. It seems to have developed after the conversion of Constantine, when Christianity becomes a political tool, that now you have the church being responsible for your immortal soul. And you must conform to the principles of the church in order that the whole idea that your immortal souls go someplace to eternal bliss is actually one of the main factors that energized the whole Crusades.
All right, so let's go over this. When was the Council of Nicaea?
It was around 320, 340. I'm not sure the exact date, but It was in the 4th century.
In the 4th century. Let's date this. I want to make it very clear that something very curious and mysterious went on here. So I would have to say that even by the end of the 1st century, 100 AD, by around that time, changes were beginning to occur. And why? Because of one decisive thing. We can't leave this out. We'll have to come back to it over and over again. It's something that honest readers of the New Testament must come to terms with and deal with, above all, They must deal with it honestly. And that is, again, both Jesus and Paul, I'm going to use that subject of my sentence, both Jesus and Paul expected the kingdom of God to be coming very soon, in realistic human terms.
Okay.
Neither of them foresaw 2,000 years of delay. That too is alien to the New Testament. We have to come to terms with the fact that there was an immediacy in the expectation of the kingdom of God that was not fulfilled. This is important because it's clearly a main component in the fact you can already start to see the trouble brewing in Paul's time. People kept saying, when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? And now it's 65. And now the calamity of the destruction of the Second Temple occurs in 70. A terrible event which makes life even more curious at that time. And a terrible calamity for the Jews. Any argument that this was the Messiah who, well, maybe this is the foreshadowing, and yes, there were revolts, Bar Kokhba, there were whatever. The kingdom of God, Jesus never came back.
Which is something the book of Revelations that was written probably after 100 AD is attempting to deal with. But
that's right. And some texts in the New Testament are there, including some texts of Paul, to deal with this conspicuous and growing problem of the delay.
Let me respond as a Christian. Let me respond to, if that is the case, and what one of the central tenets of what they thought was going to happen never did,
right?
Does that invalidate their message?
That's the question that honest Christians have to face. You said it perfectly. The only thing you didn't do was put it in a frame, because it's that important a question. Does the fact that the expectation of the imminent coming of the kingdom of God, does the fact that that did not happen, and that we honestly must confess that in that sense they got it wrong, does that invalidate the basic driving ideas?
Well, it would bring you to a number of crucial issues, in that if you believe that Jesus Christ was the actual Son of God and how could he possibly have been wrong about this?
Yes,
when he shared the same knowledge?
The problems that you get when you get into that Christology or Christology aspect of things, when that also starts centuries later. I like to stick with the New Testament, in which the status of Jesus as Messiah is almost clear enough, although there's the Messianic secret, which even muddles that one, and in which the claim that Jesus was God, that's a curious one too.
Well, let me answer my own question here in a way that will make it a little bit less. Jesus himself admits that he does not know the time or the hour, that only the Father knows the time or the hour of when things will happen.
Now you're really on the right track, because yes, that's the side of it that I want to talk about. The side of it where you're dealing with the New Testament itself, and where Jesus himself says, I can't tell you the exact time it's going to happen. Apparently then, when he's walking around with the apostles, they too, now we're rewinding all the way back, but he's walking these dusty roads of Galilee, facing the question, Rabbi or Master, as they spoke to Jesus, so when exactly is this kingdom of God that you're talking about? When exactly is it going to happen? And Jesus, you're right. The texts that we do have say you'll never know, and in fact, when it does come, it's at the moment that you least expect it.